the quiet northern reaches of ancient Greece, where mountains rose like silent guardians and rivers whispered through fertile plains, the kingdom of Macedonia waited on the edge of destiny. This was not yet the center of the known world, but a rugged land of warriors, horses, and hard winters. As night settles over these hills, we begin our journey into the life of a boy who would one day reshape history itself. His name was Alexander, the year was 356 BCE. In the Macedonian capital of Pella, the palace lay still beneath the stars. Torches flickered softly against stone walls as Queen Olympias gave birth to a son. Ancient writers tell us that on this very night, the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus burned to the ground, an event later interpreted as an omen. Legends would grow around this moment, but for now, there was only a child, born into a world of ambition, prophecy, and power. Alexander was the son of King Philip II of Macedonia, a man of relentless will and unmatched military genius. Philip had transformed Macedonia from a fractured backwater into a rising force. Through discipline, innovation, and diplomacy, he forged the most effective army Greece had ever seen. Long spears called sarissas, trained phalanxes, and a professional standing army became the tools of Macedonian dominance. This was the world Alexander was born into, a world already shaped by conquest. His mother, Olympias, was no ordinary queen. A princess of Epirus, she was deeply religious, devoted to mystical rites, and fiercely protective of her son. She believed Alexander was destined for greatness, even divine favor. Some nights, she spoke of Zeus himself, claiming the king of the gods watched over her child. Whether these stories were faith or strategy, they planted in Alexander's mind the idea that he was meant for more than an ordinary life. As Alexander grew, the palace corridors echoed with lessons of war and rule. He watched his father receive ambassadors and punish traitors. He saw how loyalty was rewarded and weakness destroyed. Yet Philip was often away, campaigning across Greece, leaving Alexander under the intense influence of Olympias. Between them, the boy was pulled between two powerful visions, one of calculated conquest, the other of destined glory. From an early age, Alexander showed signs of uncommon intelligence and fierce emotion. He listened intently to stories of heroes, Achilles above all. Homer's Iliad became his constant companion, a guidebook for life in war. He imagined himself standing on battlefields of legend, driven by honor and eternal fame. Even as a child, sleep did not dull his ambition, it sharpened it. One story from his youth reveals much about his nature. When Alexander was barely a teenager, a powerful horse named Bucephalus was brought to Philip's court. No man could ride him. The horse reared and bucked, terrified and untamed. While others stepped back, Alexander stepped forward. He noticed the horse feared its own shadow. Turning Bucephalus toward the sun, Alexander calmed him, mounted him, and rode with confidence. Philip, watching in silence, is said to have wept. He told his son to seek a kingdom worthy of him, for Macedonia was too small. Education was taken seriously for the young prince. At 13, Philip secured the greatest teacher in Greece, Aristotle. In a quiet retreat at Mysa, beneath trees and stone arches, Alexander studied philosophy, science, medicine, and politics. Aristotle taught him logic and reason, but also hierarchy, the belief that Greeks were naturally superior to others, a lesson that would later shape Alexander's rule. Knowledge, Aristotle taught, was another form of power, yet Alexander was never meant to be only a thinker. Physical training hardened his body as much as ideas sharpened his mind. He learned to fight, to hunt, to command. Macedonian boys were raised with discipline and endurance, and Alexander excelled among them. By 16, he was already acting as regent in Philip's absence, crushing revolts and commanding troops. Childhood ended early in a world like this, but beneath the surface of preparation, tension brewed. Philip's later marriages threatened Alexander's position as heir. Court politics turned dangerous. Olympias and Philip grew bitter toward one another, and Alexander often stood caught between them. At a drunken banquet, insults turned public, and Alexander stormed out, humiliated but unbroken. These moments taught him a harsh truth: power was never secure. Despite conflict, Alexander admired his father deeply. He studied Philip's strategies, learned from his victories, and absorbed his vision of a united Greece. Philip dreamed of invading Persia, the ancient enemy across the sea. He trained his army for this purpose, but fate would not allow him to finish the plan. In 336 BCE, during a celebration at Ægina, King Philip II was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. The kingdom fell silent in shock. Alexander was just 20 years old. In a single moment, childhood, training, and expectation converged. The crown was his, enemies moved quickly, rivals questioned his legitimacy. Greek city-states whispered of rebellion. Tribes along Macedonia's borders prepared to test the young king. But Alexander did not hesitate. With calm decisiveness, he secured his throne, eliminated threats, and won the loyalty of the army. When he spoke to his soldiers, his voice carried certainty. They saw Philip's strength in him, and something more. As night settles again over Macedonia, the boy is gone. In his place stands a king, forged by ambition, belief, and destiny. The path ahead will lead across deserts, rivers, and empires. But for now, the journey is only beginning. Rest easy, as the world prepares for the rise of Alexander the Great. The death of King Philip II did not bring rest to Macedonia. It brought uncertainty. In the ancient world, the passing of a ruler was an invitation, an open door for rivals, rebels, and foreign enemies. As dawn broke over the royal city of Ægina, the body of the fallen king lay still, but the kingdom around him stirred with danger. Alexander was only 20 years old when he was proclaimed king. Many doubted him. To some, he was still a boy shaped by philosophers rather than battle. To others, he was the son of a dangerous woman, born of intrigue and prophecy. Across Greece, city-states that had bowed to Philip's authority began to whisper again of freedom. Beyond the borders, tribal leaders sharpened their blades. The world waited to see if Macedonia would fracture. Alexander moved swiftly. He understood something his enemies did not: hesitation was weakness. Within days, he secured the loyalty of the Macedonian army, standing before hardened veterans who had fought beside his father for decades. He spoke not as a child king, but as a commander. He promised continuity, strength, and vengeance against those who challenged Macedonian rule. The soldiers struck their shields in approval. Their loyalty would be his greatest weapon. The court, however, was less stable. Royal bloodlines were dangerous things. Rivals with claims to the throne still lived, and Alexander knew the price of mercy in such moments. In a series of decisive actions, potential challengers were removed, some exiled, others executed. Ancient historians would later argue over cruelty and necessity, but the result was clear. There would be no civil war. Macedonia would have one king. With his position secured at home, Alexander turned his gaze outward. To the south, the Greek city-states stirred. Athens, Thebes, and others remembered the days of independence before Philip's dominance. They believed the young king could be tested. Alexander answered not with letters, but with movement. Leading his army south, he marched through Thessaly, crossing mountain passes thought impassable. The speed of his advance stunned the Greeks. When he appeared at Thermopylae, the same narrow pass once held by Leonidas against Persia, resistance melted away. One by one, the cities reaffirmed their loyalty. At Corinth, Alexander was named leader of the League of Corinth, inheriting his father's command over a united Greece. There, in the quiet of Corinth, Alexander met the philosopher Diogenes. The old man lived simply, unconcerned with power. When Alexander offered to grant him anything he wished, Diogenes replied only that the king was blocking his sunlight. Alexander laughed and later said that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. Even at this early stage, he was learning that conquest alone did not define greatness, but peace was fragile. As Alexander campaigned north against the Thracian tribes, news arrived that Greece had risen in rebellion behind him. Thebes, proud and defiant, had cast off Macedonian control, believing Alexander dead or distracted. It was a dangerous miscalculation. Alexander turned his army south again, moving with relentless speed. In less than 2 weeks, he stood before the walls of Thebes. The city had once defeated Sparta. It had raised legends. Now, it faced a king who would not allow defiance to spread. Negotiations failed. The Thebans refused to submit. What followed was swift and devastating. Alexander ordered the assault. Macedonian troops poured through the city, street by street. Buildings burned. Resistance collapsed. By the end, Thebes was destroyed. Its population was killed or sold into slavery, and the city itself was left in ruins. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message was unmistakable. Greece would not rebel again. Athens, watching in horror, chose submission. Alexander had shown the world what defiance cost, and what obedience ensured. After Thebes, Alexander returned north. His authority was absolute. Where Philip had used diplomacy and pressure, Alexander added fear and awe. Yet beneath the brutality was calculation. He needed Greece united. His father's dream still lay ahead, Persia. Before turning east, Alexander honored the gods. He visited Delphi, seeking the oracle of Apollo. Tradition says the priestess refused to speak on an inauspicious day, but Alexander demanded prophecy. In her agitation, she cried out that he was invincible. Alexander accepted this as divine confirmation and left satisfied. By now, stories followed him wherever he went. Some said he was favored by Zeus. Others said he carried the spirit of Achilles. His soldiers believed he was unstoppable. Belief, in an ancient army, was as powerful as steel. The Macedonian military was now the most disciplined force in the world. The phalanx held firm, shields locked and spears bristling like a wall of iron. Cavalry units moved with speed and precision, striking where enemies were weakest. Alexander drilled constantly, preparing his men not just for battles, but for a war that would span continents. In the quiet evenings, before sleep claimed the camps, Alexander studied maps of Asia. Across the Hellespont lay the Persian Empire, vast, wealthy, and confident. It was the same empire that had once invaded Greece and been driven back by united resistance. Now, Alexander intended to reverse history. By the age of 22, he had secured a kingdom, crushed rebellion, and unified Greece. The boy born in Pella was gone. In his place stood a king hardened by blood and certainty, guided by ambition and belief in destiny. As the night deepens, the army rests. Fires glow softly across the Macedonian camps. Horses breathe in the dark. Steel lies ready. Beyond the sea, an empire sleeps, unaware that its reckoning draws near, and Alexander, restless even in silence, prepares to cross into legend. As the first light of spring touched the Aegean Sea, the Macedonian army gathered at the edge of Europe. Before them lay the narrow stretch of water known as the Hellespont, a boundary between worlds. Beyond it stood Asia, vast, ancient, and ruled by the greatest empire of its age. For Alexander, this crossing was more than a military movement. It was a moment charged with memory, myth, and destiny. In 334 BCE, Alexander led approximately 40,000 soldiers and cavalry toward the Persian Empire. Compared to the enormous resources of Persia, his force was small. Yet it was disciplined, loyal, and bound by belief in its young king. As the ships crossed the strait, Alexander is said to have cast a spear into Asian soil, symbolically claiming the land by right of conquest. The war had begun. Upon landing, Alexander made a deliberate pilgrimage to Troy. There, among the ruins of ancient legend, he honored Achilles, his childhood hero. He ran races around the tomb, made offerings, and took sacred armor said to date back to the Age of Heroes. To his soldiers, this act bound past and present together. Alexander was not merely invading Asia, he was stepping into a story older than memory. The Persians, confident in their power, were slow to respond. Satraps, regional governors of the empire, gathered forces near the Granicus River, expecting to crush the invaders before they could advance inland. They underestimated both Alexander's speed and his resolve. The Battle of the Granicus was Alexander's first major test against Persian forces. The river itself was steep and fast, with enemy cavalry positioned along its banks. Advisors urged caution, but Alexander chose boldness. Leading the companion cavalry himself, he charged across the river under a hail of missiles. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Persian nobles fell, one by one, as Macedonian discipline broke the enemy line. Alexander himself was nearly killed, struck on the helmet by an axe. Only the quick action of a trusted companion saved his life. When the fighting ended, the Persians were routed. Asia Minor lay open. Rather than terrorizing the cities he captured, Alexander chose a calculated approach. Greek cities under Persian control were freed and allowed to govern themselves. Persian officials who surrendered were often spared. This strategy earned him support among the local population and weakened Persian authority from within. As he marched south along the coast of Asia Minor, Alexander denied the Persian navy its ports, one city at a time. This slow, methodical advance cut off Persian supply lines and secured the sea without a naval battle. Strategy, not recklessness, guided the campaign. In the winter of 333 BCE, Alexander faced the Persian king himself for the first time. Darius III, ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, had assembled a vast army. Confident in numbers, Darius chose the battlefield near the town of Issus. But the terrain, a narrow plain between mountains and sea, neutralized his advantage. At the Battle of Issus, Alexander once again led from the front. As the armies clashed, dust and noise swallowed the field. Macedonian phalanxes held firm, while cavalry maneuvered with precision. Alexander spotted Darius's position and drove directly toward him. When the Persian king fled, his army followed. Victory was swift and decisive. In the aftermath, Alexander captured Darius's family, his mother, wife, and children. Contrary to Persian expectations, they were treated with respect and dignity. Alexander ensured their safety, a gesture that echoed across the empire. He wanted to be seen not as a destroyer, but as a rightful successor. With the eastern Mediterranean opening before him, Alexander turned south. The cities of Phoenicia fell, one by one, except for Tyre. Situated on an island and protected by strong walls, Tyre defied him. What followed was one of the most remarkable sieges in ancient history. For 7 months, Alexander's army labored to build a causeway across the sea, stone by stone. Tyrian ships harassed the workers. Storms destroyed progress. Yet Alexander persisted. When the walls finally fell, Tyre was taken by force. The city paid dearly for its resistance. The message was clear: surrender brought mercy, defiance brought ruin. After Tyre, Gaza resisted and suffered a similar fate. Egypt, however, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. Persian rule had been harsh, and the Egyptians saw in Alexander a new pharaoh. He traveled to Memphis, where he was crowned according to ancient tradition. In the desert, Alexander undertook a perilous journey to the oracle of Ammonius at Siwa. There, priests greeted him as the son of a god. What was said between them remains a mystery, but Alexander emerged changed. He now believed fully in his divine favor. On the Mediterranean coast, he founded a new city, Alexandria. Designed as a center of trade, learning, and culture, it would become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Even amid war, Alexander was building for the future. As the army rested in Egypt, the scale of the campaign became clear. Asia had not fallen. Persia was wounded, but not defeated. Darius still lived, and the heart of the empire lay far to the east. Under the quiet desert stars, Alexander prepared for the next phase of his journey. The path ahead would lead deeper into unknown lands, toward a final confrontation that would decide the fate of empires. For now, sleep comes softly. The sea is calm. The fires burn low. And history moves forward, one step closer to legend. The Persian Empire was wounded, but it was far from defeated. Beyond the deserts of Egypt and the coasts of the Mediterranean lay the empire's vast heartland, endless plains, ancient cities, and royal capitals heavy with gold and memory. Darius III still ruled, and he would not surrender without a final stand. As Alexander turned east once more, the air itself seemed to carry the weight of destiny. In the autumn of 331 BCE, Alexander marched toward Mesopotamia. Scouts rode ahead, carrying news of Darius's preparations. The Persian king had gathered an army larger than any Alexander had yet faced, tens of thousands of infantry, cavalry from across the empire, chariots fitted with blades, and even war elephants. Darius chose the plain of Gaugamela, a wide, open field prepared carefully to favor Persian numbers. On the night before the battle, Alexander slept calmly. Ancient writers tell us that while his generals worried, he rested without fear. Confidence, earned through victory, had replaced doubt. Before dawn, he addressed his troops, reminding them of how far they had come, from Macedonia, across seas and deserts, into the heart of the world's greatest empire. As the sun rose over Gaugamela, the two armies faced each other in silence. Dust hung low over the plain. Then the battle began. Alexander once again led from the right flank, commanding the companion cavalry. The Macedonian phalanx advanced steadily, shields locked, spears bristling. Persian chariots charged, but disciplined infantry opened their ranks, allowing the chariots to pass through before cutting them down. The field erupted into chaos, yet within it, Alexander saw an opening. As Persian forces stretched to outflank the Macedonians, Alexander drove forward at an angle, pulling Darius's center apart. At the decisive moment, he charged straight toward the Persian king. Darius hesitated, then turned and fled. His army, seeing their ruler retreat, collapsed into panic. Gaugamela was not merely a victory, it was the end of Persian power. Darius escaped, but his empire did not. Alexander marched south to Babylon. The ancient city opened its gates without resistance. Priests, nobles, and citizens welcomed him as a liberator. He honored Babylonian traditions, offered sacrifices to local gods, and preserved the city. Unlike conquerors before him, Alexander understood that ruling an empire required respect as well as force. From Babylon, he moved to Susa, one of Persia's royal capitals. There, immense treasure fell into his hands, gold, silver, and riches accumulated over centuries. Alexander distributed wealth to his soldiers, securing their loyalty, but kept much for the future. He was no longer leading a raid. He was governing an empire. Next came Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian kingship. Its palaces stood on high terraces, carved with reliefs showing the empire's glory. Alexander entered as victor, walking halls once reserved for the great king. For months, his army rested their point. One night, after a banquet heavy with wine, a fire broke out. Flames consumed the wooden roofs of Persepolis, lighting the night sky. Ancient sources disagree on whether the burning was deliberate or accidental. Some say it was revenge for Persia's earlier destruction of Greek cities. Others claim it was a moment of drunken impulse. Whatever the truth, Persepolis burned, and with it, a symbol of Persian dominance turned to ash. Darius, now a fugitive, fled east. Alexander pursued him relentlessly across harsh terrain. The chase was long and exhausting, stretching supply lines and patience. When Alexander finally caught up, Darius had already been betrayed by his own men. He was found wounded, dying in a cart. Alexander ordered Darius covered with his cloak and honored as a king. With Darius's death, Alexander declared himself the rightful successor to the Persian throne. He adopted Persian dress, customs, and court rituals, a decision that pleased some and angered others, especially among his Macedonian companions. The conquest of Persia was complete, but Alexander did not stop. Victory had not satisfied him, it had transformed him. No longer just a Macedonian king, he now ruled over diverse peoples, Persians, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks. To bind them together, he pursued a vision of unity. Persian nobles were appointed to high office. Soldiers from across the empire were recruited. Marriages between Macedonians and Persians were encouraged. Alexander believed he could fuse cultures into a single ruling class. To some, this was visionary. To others, it was betrayal, yet Alexander's authority remained absolute. His army, though weary, followed him still. Each victory carried them further from home and deeper into unfamiliar lands. As the empire slept under a new ruler, Alexander stood at the edge of Persia and looked east. Beyond lay mountains and kingdoms unknown to the Greeks, Bactria, Sogdia, and the distant lands of India. Few could imagine going further. Alexander could imagine nothing else. Under a sky filled with foreign stars, the conqueror rested. The Persian Empire had fallen, but the journey was far from over. History, once again, prepared to turn its page. Sleep now, as the fires of empire fade into memory, and the road ahead stretches into the unknown. With the Persian Empire broken, many believed the war was over. The wealth of Asia lay in Alexander's hands, and his name echoed from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Yet for Alexander, conquest was not a destination, it was a direction. Beyond Persia stretched lands unknown to most Greeks, regions of high mountains, fierce tribes, and uncharted horizons. It was toward these distant frontiers that he now turned. Alexander marched into Media and then eastward into Bactria and Sogdia, territories that today lie across parts of Afghanistan and Central Asia. These were not rich ceremonial capitals like Babylon or Persepolis. They were harsh lands shaped by extremes, burning summers, freezing winters, and people hardened by survival. Here, Alexander would face not empires, but resistance. The local rulers did not meet him on open plains. Instead, they vanished into mountains and deserts, striking suddenly and disappearing again. Warfare changed. There were no grand battles, only sieges, ambushes, and relentless marches through unforgiving terrain. The Macedonian army, trained for set-piece combat, was forced to adapt. Alexander responded with patience and brutality in equal measure. Strongholds perched on cliffs were besieged and taken one by one. When resistance was stubborn, punishment was severe. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were destroyed. The message was unmistakable: there would be no safe refuge from his reach. Yet even as he crushed opposition, Alexander sought to rule, not merely conquer. He founded new cities, Alexandrias, across Central Asia, planting Greek culture, administration, and military presence deep in foreign lands. These cities became outposts of control and symbols of permanence in a region that resisted both. It was during this campaign that cracks began to show within Alexander's inner circle. His adoption of Persian customs, royal dress, court rituals, and demands for proskynesis, a gesture of bowing, alienated many Macedonians. To them, these practices blurred the line between king and god. Tension simmered beneath the surface. Tragedy struck during a drunken banquet when Alexander, in a rage, killed Clitus the Black, one of his closest companions and the man who had once saved his life at the Granicus. Clitus had criticized Alexander for abandoning Macedonian traditions. The moment passed in violence and regret. Alexander mourned deeply, but the act could not be undone. The conqueror was no longer untouched by his own power. In Sogdia, Alexander encountered fierce resistance led by local warlords. One stronghold, known as the Sogdian Rock, was considered impregnable. Its defenders mocked Alexander, claiming he would need soldiers with wings to take it. Alexander answered by sending climbers up the cliff face at night. By dawn, the fortress surrendered. Among the captives was a noblewoman named Roxana. Ancient sources describe her as intelligent and striking. Alexander married her, not solely for love, but as a political alliance. It was another step in his effort to blend cultures, to become a ruler of all, not just a conqueror of some, but blending cultures came at a cost. Discipline frayed. Exhaustion weighed heavily on the army. Many soldiers longed for home, for Macedonia, for an end to endless war. Alexander, however, looked eastward still. Central Asia tested him in ways Persia had not. There was no single king to defeat, no capital whose fall would end resistance. Victory here came slowly, through endurance. Years passed in this relentless struggle, hardening Alexander and his army alike, yet even in hardship, Alexander's vision expanded. He studied the lands he crossed, their rivers and mountains. He collected knowledge as eagerly as territory. To him, the world was something to be understood, not merely subdued. By 327 BCE, Central Asia was finally under control. The rebellion had been crushed, the cities secured. Alexander stood at the edge of the known Greek world once more. Beyond lay India, a land of legend, wealth, and mystery, spoken of in fragments by travelers and scholars. The army paused. Snow covered the high passes. Fires burned low against the cold night. Alexander gathered his commanders and spoke of what lay ahead. Some hesitated. Others remained silent. None dared openly refuse. As sleep settles over the camps of Central Asia, the wind moves through the mountains like a distant voice. The road behind is soaked with effort and loss. The road ahead leads deeper into the unknown, and Alexander, driven by a hunger that cannot be filled, prepares once more to march. Beyond the high passes of the Hindu Kush lay a land that existed more in legend than in fact for the Greeks. India was spoken of as a place of endless rivers, vast armies, and creatures unknown to the Western world. Few Macedonians could imagine what awaited them there. Alexander could imagine nothing else. In 327 BCE, after years of hardship in Central Asia, Alexander led his army south and east into the Indian subcontinent. The terrain changed quickly. Dry mountains gave way to fertile valleys and powerful rivers fed by seasonal rains. The air grew heavy. The land itself seemed alive, moving and shifting under unfamiliar skies. Local rulers responded in different ways. Some resisted. Others submitted. The king of Taxila, known as Ambai, welcomed Alexander as an ally. He provided supplies, troops, and intelligence about the kingdoms beyond the Indus River. In return, Alexander confirmed him as ruler. Once again, diplomacy and conquest moved hand in hand. Crossing the Indus was a feat in itself. Engineers built bridges and transport ships while soldiers stood watch. When the army reached the far bank, they entered a world untouched by Persian or Greek rule. Here, Alexander faced a powerful local king named Porus, who ruled lands east of the Hydaspes River. Porus was no minor ruler. He commanded a disciplined army and, most terrifying to the Macedonians, war elephants. These massive animals, armored and towering, were unlike anything Alexander's troops had faced. Their size and strength could break formations and shatter morale. The Hydaspes River stood between the two armies, swollen by monsoon rains. Porus waited, confident that the river would prevent crossing. Alexander waited as well, watching, learning, planning. Night after night, his forces feigned preparations, conditioning the enemy to expect nothing. Then, under cover of darkness and storm, Alexander led a portion of his army upstream. Rain masked the sound of movement. When dawn came, the Macedonians were already across. The Battle of the Hydaspes began. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. Elephants charged, trampling soldiers and horses. Macedonian infantry adapted quickly, targeting the animals' handlers and legs. Cavalry struck from the flanks. Slowly, discipline overcame terror. Porus fought bravely, even after being wounded, refusing to retreat. When the battle ended, Porus stood defeated but unbroken. Alexander, impressed by his courage, asked how he wished to be treated. Porus replied, "As a king." Alexander honored him, allowing Porus to continue ruling his lands as a satrap under Macedonian authority. It was a pattern repeated again and again. Respect earned loyalty where fear could not. After Hydaspes, Alexander pressed onward. He founded new cities and advanced deeper into India. But the farther east he marched, the heavier the burden became. The monsoon rains soaked armor and supplies. Heat and humidity drained strength. Diseases spread. The men, far from home and worn by years of war, grew restless. When the army reached the Hyphasis River, Alexander announced his intention to continue east. Beyond lay the Nanda Empire, said to possess vast armies and thousands of elephants. The soldiers refused. For the first time, Alexander faced open mutiny. He argued. He reminded them of their victories, their glory, their shared destiny. But the men stood firm. They had reached the edge of what they could endure. After days of isolation in his tent, Alexander conceded. The march east was over. The decision marked a turning point. Though still undefeated, Alexander learned that even kings of legend depended on the will of their followers. The army turned south, following the rivers toward the sea. The return journey was no less deadly. Battles were fought against fierce tribes along the way. In one such fight, Alexander was seriously wounded by an arrow to the chest. For a time, his life hung in the balance. When he recovered, the army's loyalty deepened. They had nearly lost him, and the world seemed unthinkable without him. Eventually, the army reached the Indian Ocean. For the first time, Alexander stood at the edge of the Eastern Sea. He ordered sacrifices to the gods and stared out at the horizon. Beyond it lay lands he would never see. As the sun set over the water, the campaign in India ended. Victory had been won, but at a cost measured not in gold or territory, but in exhaustion and loss. The road home would be long and dangerous. As night falls over the rivers of India, the army rests. Rain softens the land. Fires flicker in the darkness. And Alexander, still dreaming of greatness, prepares for the journey back toward the heart of his empire. Turning back from India did not mean safety. In many ways, it marked the most dangerous phase of Alexander's journey. The army was exhausted, stretched thin by years of war and unfamiliar climates. Supplies were low. Morale, though loyal, was fragile. Yet Alexander chose not the easiest road home, but the most challenging, one that would test both his leadership and the will of his men. The army split into sections. One force would travel by sea under the command of Nearchus, exploring the coastline of the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf. Alexander himself led the main body westward through the Gadrosian Desert, a vast and merciless expanse in what is now southern Iran. Ancient writers describe this region as one of the harshest on earth, a land of sand, stone, and silence. Why Alexander chose this route remains debated. Some say it was a strategic decision, others a desire to surpass all previous conquerors. Whatever the reason, the march through Gadrosia became a nightmare. The sun burned relentlessly by day. At night, the cold crept in without mercy. Water was scarce. Supply lines failed. Soldiers collapsed where they stood. Horses and pack animals died, leaving weapons and armor abandoned in the sand. The desert did not care for rank or bravery. It took all without distinction. Alexander marched on foot beside his men, refusing special treatment. When water was brought to him in a helmet, he poured it onto the ground, unwilling to drink while others suffered. Acts like these preserved loyalty when discipline alone might have failed. Still, losses were staggering. Ancient sources suggest that thousands perished, not in battle, but from exhaustion, thirst, and despair. The desert stretched endlessly, offering no landmarks, no mercy. Progress was measured not in distance, but in survival. When at last the army emerged from Gadrosia, it was a shadow of what had entered. The men were thinner, quieter, changed. But they had survived. And Alexander, though visibly worn, remained unbroken. Reunited with Nearchus and the fleet, Alexander learned that the sea voyage had been equally perilous. Storms, unfamiliar tides, and hostile shores had claimed many lives. Yet the exploration had succeeded. New routes were mapped. Knowledge had been gained. Even suffering served purpose. As the army moved back into Persia, Alexander began the work of rebuilding and ruling. He punished corrupt officials, reorganized satrapies, and restored order. His vision of empire demanded more than conquest. It required administration, justice, and stability. In Susa, Alexander staged a remarkable event, a mass wedding. Macedonian officers married Persian noblewomen in a grand ceremony meant to unite cultures at the highest level. Alexander himself married 2 Persian princesses, strengthening his claim as rightful king of Asia. To some, it symbolized unity. To others, it confirmed fears that the old Macedonia was gone. Tensions within the army grew. When Alexander announced plans to incorporate Persian troops into the Macedonian ranks, resentment flared. Veterans who had followed him from Greece felt replaced, forgotten. At Opis, they openly protested. Alexander responded with fury, accusing them of ingratitude. He dismissed them from service, then, seeing their remorse, forgave them. The reconciliation was emotional. Soldiers wept openly, begging to remain with him. It was a reminder that loyalty, though strained, still bound them together, yet signs of war were unmistakable. Alexander's health suffered. His temper grew unpredictable. The burden of empire pressed heavily upon him. The conqueror who once charged joyfully into battle now ruled through exhaustion and necessity. In 324 BCE, tragedy struck again. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend and companion since youth, fell ill and died. The loss devastated Alexander. He mourned deeply, ordering extravagant funeral rites and honoring Hephaestion as a hero. Some ancient writers suggest Alexander never fully recovered from this grief. With the army slowly returning west, Alexander turned his attention to Arabia. Even after everything, India, deserts, rebellion, he planned another campaign. There were always new horizons, new worlds beyond the edge of maps. As the army settled in Babylon, preparations began. Ships were built. Supplies gathered. The city buzzed with activity. But beneath the movement lay an unspoken question: how long could this continue? At night, Babylon was quiet and heavy with heat. The Euphrates flowed calmly past ancient walls. Alexander walked its banks, still restless, still driven. His body bore the marks of years of war, but his ambition remained untouched. The journey home had cost him dearly. The desert had taken thousands. Power had taken friends. Time had taken innocence. Yet Alexander stood at the center of the world, ruler of an empire stretching farther than any before it. As sleep settles over Babylon, the fires dim. The soldiers rest. And Alexander, undefeated in battle, moves unknowingly toward his final chapter. Babylon stood at the center of the world Alexander had created. Ancient, immense, and heavy with history, the city became his final capital. Its walls enclosed temples, palaces, and canals that reflected torchlight in the warm night air. Here, after more than a decade of relentless conquest, Alexander paused, not in triumph, but in preparation. Plans filled his days. Arabia lay to the south, unexplored and rich with possibility. New harbors were to be built, new fleets launched. Ambassadors from distant lands arrived seeking favor or alliance. To them, Alexander was no longer merely a king, he was a force of nature, a ruler whose reach seemed without limit. Yet beneath the activity, something had changed. Alexander was 32 years old, but his body carried the weight of many lifetimes. He had suffered countless wounds, cuts, fractures, fevers, and years of exhaustion. His nights were restless. His moods unpredictable. Those closest to him noticed the strain, even if they dared not speak of it. In early June of 323 BCE, Alexander attended a banquet in Babylon. Wine flowed freely, as it often did in Macedonian tradition. Afterward, he complained of pain and fever. At first, no one was alarmed. Illness was common, and Alexander had recovered from worse, but the fever did not break. Over the following days, Alexander grew weaker. He struggled to stand, then to speak. Courtiers whispered in corridors. Generals watched anxiously. Rumors spread: poison, divine punishment, fate itself. Ancient sources disagree on the cause. Malaria, typhoid, complications from old wounds, all remain possible. What mattered was not how it began, but how it ended. As Alexander lay confined to his chamber, the army gathered outside the palace. Hardened soldiers, men who had crossed continents with him, demanded to see their king. They feared he was already gone. Alexander ordered the doors opened. One by one, the soldiers passed silently by his bed. Some wept openly. Others touched his hand or armor. Alexander could no longer speak, but his eyes followed them. It was a farewell without words, heavy with shared memory and loss. When asked to whom he left his empire, ancient writers record that Alexander whispered, "To the strongest." Whether truth or legend, the answer sealed the fate of everything he had built. On June 10 or 11, 323 BCE, Alexander of Macedon died in Babylon. The world stood still. An empire without a successor is not an inheritance, it is an invitation to conflict. Alexander left no clear heir, only an unborn son and a half-brother unfit to rule alone. His generals, once united by loyalty to him, now faced one another as rivals. For days, confusion reigned. The body of Alexander was said to remain uncorrupted, a sign, some believed, of divinity. Plans were made for a grand funeral. His body was placed in a golden sarcophagus, later replaced by glass, allowing all to see the fallen conqueror, but unity did not last. The empire fractured almost immediately. The wars of the successors, the Diadochi, began, tearing apart Alexander's creation. Macedonia, Egypt, Asia, and the eastern lands fell under separate rulers. The dream of a united world faded into ambition and bloodshed, yet Alexander's legacy did not vanish. Greek language and culture spread across the lands he had conquered, blending with local traditions. Cities he founded became centers of learning and trade. Alexandria in Egypt rose as a beacon of knowledge, home to scholars, scientists, and libraries that would shape the future. Alexander himself became legend. To some, he was a hero without equal. To others, a destroyer. To many, he was both. Stories of his deeds traveled farther than his armies ever had, carried by merchants, poets, and soldiers long after his death. As time passed, Alexander grew larger than life. He became a figure claimed by many cultures: Greek, Persian, Egyptian, even Indian. Each remembered him differently, yet all remembered him. In the quiet halls of Babylon, where the conqueror breathed his last, the empire he forged began to dissolve. But something more enduring remained. Alexander had changed the shape of the world. He had connected distant lands, altered histories, and expanded the boundaries of what humans believed possible. As night deepens and the city sleeps, the legend rests, the march is over. The road has ended. And Alexander, who once dreamed of conquering the world, now belongs to history. When Alexander died in Babylon, the silence he left behind was vast. It stretched across continents, from the mountains of Macedonia to the rivers of India. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, uncertain how to move forward without the man who had driven it relentlessly onward. The empire Alexander created did not survive him as a single whole. His generals, men who had once followed him without question, now faced one another with suspicion and ambition. They had shared his victories, but not his vision. Without a clear heir, power became something to be seized, not preserved. Almost immediately, the wars of the successors began. These conflicts would last for decades, reshaping Alexander's empire into new kingdoms. Ptolemy claimed Egypt, establishing a dynasty that would rule for nearly 300 years. Seleucus took control of vast eastern territories, stretching from Asia Minor to the borders of India. Antigonus and his rivals fought for dominance in Macedonia and Greece. The unity Alexander dreamed of dissolved into rivalry and war, yet even as the empire fractured politically, it remained connected culturally. Greek language spread across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, becoming the common tongue of trade, government, and scholarship. Local traditions blended with Greek ideas, creating a new cultural world historians would later call the Hellenistic Age. It was an era shaped not by a single ruler, but by exchange. Cities founded by Alexander became living monuments to his ambition. Alexandria in Egypt stood above them all. With its great lighthouse guiding ships into harbor and its legendary library collecting knowledge from every known land, the city embodied the fusion of cultures Alexander had envisioned. Scholars studied astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy there, building foundations that would influence civilizations centuries later. In Asia, Greek-style cities took root along trade routes, linking east and west. Art changed. Statues combined Greek form with local symbolism. Coins bore Alexander's image long after his death, his face becoming a symbol of authority even for rulers who had never met him. Alexander's legacy was not only cultural, but psychological. He expanded the idea of what a single individual could achieve. Before him, the world had seemed vast and separate. After him, it felt connected, navigable, knowable. He turned distant lands into chapters of a shared story, yet this legacy came at a cost. Entire cities were destroyed. Populations were displaced. Countless lives were lost to war, disease, and exhaustion. Alexander's conquests brought knowledge and connection, but also suffering. To some, he was a civilizer. To others, a conqueror whose ambition knew no restraint. Ancient historians themselves struggled to define him. Some praised his courage, generosity, and vision. Others condemned his cruelty, impulsiveness, and thirst for glory. Even those closest to him disagreed on who he truly was. Perhaps Alexander was all of these things at once. He was a student of philosophy who believed himself chosen by the gods. A king who fought alongside his men, yet demanded absolute loyalty. A ruler who respected foreign customs, yet crushed resistance without mercy. He lived as intensely as he conquered, never slowing, never satisfied. In death, Alexander became something greater than a man. He became a story. Romans would later study his campaigns, measuring themselves against his achievements. Medieval legends would transform him into a hero of myth. In the Islamic world, he would appear as a righteous king known as Tulkarnain. Across cultures and centuries, his name endured. Even today, more than 2,000 years later, Alexander remains a figure of fascination. His life raises questions that have no simple answers. Is greatness measured by what is built, or by what is destroyed? Is unity worth the cost of conquest? Can ambition change the world without consuming the one who carries it? As the night deepens, these questions drift gently, unanswered. The world Alexander shaped moved on. Empires rose and fell. Cities grew and vanished. But the paths he carved remained. Trade routes followed his roads. Ideas followed his armies. History followed his footsteps. Somewhere, beneath layers of earth and memory, Alexander rests, his tomb lost, his bones unclaimed by any nation. Yet his presence lingers, not in stone or gold, but in the connections he forced into being. The journey that began in a quiet Macedonian palace ended in Babylon, but its echoes traveled far beyond. From that journey came a world more connected, more complex, and forever changed. Now, as the story fades into silence, the march finally comes to rest. Sleep gently, as history closes its pages, and the legend of Alexander the Great drifts into the timeless calm of memory.